In the last 18 months, a country of under 3 million people has built one of the most advanced border surveillance systems in the Western Hemisphere and pointed it at the tourists who fly in for vacation. A British passport holder landing in Montego Bay now has their face captured, verified, and stored by a Jamaican government system before reaching a hotel. An American landing in Kingston goes through the same process, using facial recognition hardware built by the same company that services security at Heathrow and JFK. That hardware operates on Jamaican soil under Jamaican law. This is not primarily a story about airport upgrades. It concerns a Caribbean nation that has built a surveillance architecture comparable to the systems operated by Britain and the United States, and is now applying that architecture to citizens of the same countries that require Jamaicans to obtain a visa before entering. The following sections lay out how that system was built, what it does, and where the asymmetry between the two sides currently stands. The systems described below were not introduced as a single policy but assembled in stages between 2022 and 2026. A digital travel declaration, a network of biometric arrival gates, a consolidated border management platform linking multiple security agencies, an upgraded electronic passport, and a national identification card. Each of these developments has been reported individually in Jamaican government statements and local press coverage. Considered together, they describe a border and identity infrastructure that did not exist in the country as recently as 2022. This account draws on statements from Jamaica's Passport, Immigration and Citizenship Agency, its National Identification and Registration Authority, its Foreign Ministry, statements from the private airport operator MBJ Airports, coverage in the Jamaica Gleaner, and public statements from UK government officials and the UK Parliament petition system. Where a figure or date is stated, it reflects what has been publicly reported by these sources as of mid-2026. For decades, flying into Jamaica involved a standard process. During the flight, a crew member would distribute paper declaration forms. Passengers filled them out using pens borrowed from neighboring seats, often while the aircraft was in turbulence. That form was known as the C5. It requested identification details, travel information, and customs declarations, including quantities of goods such as rum being brought into the country. The paper version of the form was slow to process, easy to lose, and frequently difficult to read by the time it reached the immigration counter. The paper C5 process had been in continuous use for an extended period prior to its replacement and functioned as the standard entry procedure at Jamaican airports across multiple decades of tourism growth. Processing delays associated with the paper form were a recurring subject of traveler complaints and airport management discussions prior to the 2023 change, according to reporting on the transition at the time. In September 2023, Jamaica moved the entire C5 process onto a government digital platform. From that date, every air passenger was required to complete the declaration online before departure. Paper forms were no longer distributed on flights. Travelers now submit personal details, travel itineraries, and customs declarations through the portal and receive a QR code on approval, which is presented to border officials on arrival. Completion takes under 10 minutes, and there is no fee attached to the process. Every traveler, regardless of age or frequency of travel, is required to submit an individual form for each entry. There is no exemption for repeat visitors. Paper forms are used only during rare system outages. In practical terms, this means Jamaica now receives detailed information on every air traveler entering the country before that traveler boards the aircraft. A passenger departing Gatwick and a passenger departing JFK both transmit personal data to Jamaican border systems hours before landing. Jamaica has a record of who is arriving, when, and what they are carrying before the flight departs. For travelers who flew to Jamaica regularly over the previous 2 decades, the paper C5 process was a fixed part of the arrival routine, similar to other long-standing customs procedures at Caribbean airports. The shift to a mandatory online declaration in September 2023 replaced that routine within a single travel season, rather than through a gradual multi-year transition, which is faster than the rollout timeline typically associated with immigration policy changes in the region. In December 2023, 6 automated biometric passport gates were installed and brought into operation at Sangster International Airport in Montego Bay, the airport that processes more than 70% of the country's air arrivals. These gates verify passenger identity using facial recognition, removing the need for an immigration officer to review each passenger manually. A traveler scans their travel document, looks into a camera, and the system approves or denies entry within seconds. This installation marked the first large-scale deployment of automated biometric border control in Jamaica, replacing a process that had previously relied entirely on manual review by immigration officers at each individual counter. The change affected the busiest single point of entry into the country, given that Sangster alone accounts for more than 7 in 10 air arrivals nationally. The gates were built by SETA, a major supplier of airport and border infrastructure. The same company operates systems in terminals across Europe and North America, including facilities at Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, and other major entry points into the Schengen area. The equipment installed at Sangster is the same class of system used at those locations. Because the equipment is supplied by the same vendor used at major European and North American hubs, the underlying facial recognition and document verification technology at Sangster is not a scaled-down or regionally adapted version built specifically for a smaller market. It is the same product line deployed at some of the busiest airports in the world, which is a detail not widely reported outside of trade press covering airport infrastructure procurement. Additional gates were installed at Sangster by December 2024, ahead of the holiday travel period. Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston received 4 e-gates and 20 self-service kiosks in the same period. In May 2025, MBJ Airports Limited, the private operator running Sangster under a 30-year concession, announced a biometric upgrade covering both arrivals and departures. Shane Munro, the company's chief executive, described the objective as a single biometric identity that would allow passengers to move from check-in to boarding gate without needing to verify their identity more than once. A single biometric identity spanning check-in, security, and boarding is the model several major international airports have moved toward over the past decade, generally as part of broader efforts to reduce processing time and staffing requirements at each checkpoint. Sangster's stated goal follows that same model, applied to an airport serving a market historically associated with manual, paper-based processing rather than integrated biometric tracking. Sangster also added self-service biometric check-in kiosks, QR code-based wayfinding, automated environmental controls, and queue management systems using Bluetooth and Wi-Fi tracking. The capital program behind these upgrades was valued at $112 million, spanning 2020 to 2025. Sangster recorded over 5.2 million passengers in 2023, employs more than 7,500 people, and serves more than 60 international destinations. The airport is approaching 5 million passengers annually, and the majority hold British, American, or Canadian passports. When a British citizen's biometric data is captured at Sangster, it is processed and stored within infrastructure governed by Jamaican law and managed by Jamaican security agencies. The same applies to American travelers using the same gates. No treaty specifically authorized this arrangement, and no parliamentary or congressional hearing in either country has publicly examined what happens to that data once it enters a foreign government's systems. This is a departure from the more familiar cross-border data arrangements between Western nations, which are frequently governed by bilateral data-sharing agreements, mutual legal assistance treaties, or membership in shared intelligence and security frameworks. No comparable public framework currently governs the biometric data Jamaica collects on British and American travelers. The data is subject to Jamaica's own Data Protection Act and whatever internal retention and access policies its immigration and security agencies have adopted, which have not been detailed in public government communications reviewed for this account. Historically, biometric data collection between the Caribbean and Western countries moved in one direction. Western embassies collected biometric data from Caribbean visa applicants. Western border agencies fingerprinted and photographed Caribbean travelers on arrival. Jamaica's system reverses that flow, using equivalent technology. This arrangement differs from the pattern typically seen when advanced border technology is introduced in smaller or developing economies. In most cases, such systems are supplied by a wealthier country to a smaller one through a grant, loan, or bilateral security agreement that includes conditions on how the receiving country may use the technology. Jamaica's procurement of its biometric infrastructure was structured as a commercial contract with SETA, financed through a combination of Jamaican capital investment and international development financing, rather than as a donation or aid package tied to a single foreign government. The resulting system is operated independently by Jamaican agencies, and the data it collects on foreign travelers is not shared automatically with the travelers' home governments. The rollout has not been without problems. A letter published in the Jamaica Gleaner described congestion at the E-gates during peak periods, citing facial recognition errors and insufficient support for passengers traveling with young children. That criticism was published and acknowledged. At the same time, other travelers described the new system favorably, including a returning Jamaican resident and a visitor from New York who called the process smooth. The system has continued to expand despite the reported issues. Reported error rates and congestion of this kind are consistent with the initial deployment period of automated biometric systems in other countries, where processing speed and accuracy typically improve as software and staffing adjust to sustain passenger volume. Jamaica's continued investment in additional gates and kiosks after the initial criticism indicates the agency treated the reported issues as an operational adjustment period, rather than a reason to reverse the policy. The distinction between an adjustment period problem and a fundamental design flaw matters for how this criticism should be read. Congestion tied to unfamiliarity with a new process or to software still being tuned for local conditions is different in kind from a structural failure of the underlying approach. The reporting reviewed here describes the former specific named complaints about wait times and error rates during a defined rollout period, alongside continued expansion of the LISM technology rather than a rollback. Jamaica's last nationwide border security overhaul took place in 2004. The systems built at that time remained in use for roughly 2 decades before the current modernization began. Funding for the recent changes came primarily through international development channels rather than domestic tourism revenue alone. The Inter-American Development Bank and the European Union both contributed financing. Leadership continuity at the immigration agency also played a role. When the official who initiated the modernization program stepped down, his successor continued and expanded the plan rather than slowing it. This financing structure is a distinguishing factor in how quickly the modernization proceeded. A program of this scale, covering airports, seaports, a national database, and a new identification card, would typically require either a much larger domestic budget allocation or a longer implementation timeline if funded solely through national revenue. By combining Jamaican government funding with development bank financing and EU co-investment, the agency was able to run several of these projects in parallel rather than sequentially, which shortened the overall rollout period relative to comparable modernization programs in other middle-income countries. Running several major infrastructure projects concurrently, rather than completing them one after another, also required coordination across the multiple agencies involved, including the Immigration Agency, the National Identification Authority, the airport operator, and the technology vendor. The fact that these separate work streams converged into a functioning, interoperating system within the reported time frame indicates a level of inter-agency coordination that is not always achieved in large public infrastructure programs, where delays are more commonly associated with the number of separate institutions involved rather than the technology itself. In 2024, the Passport Immigration and Citizenship Agency issued a formal international tender to replace its border management infrastructure. The scope covered all processes, procedures, and technologies used by border security agencies to manage cross-border activity, consolidated into a single system. Andrew Winter, the former CEO of the agency who led the modernization effort before stepping down, said the existing border management system had been in place for years while newer technology was becoming available elsewhere to improve how people cross borders. He also cited the use of similar technology by criminal networks as a reason the agency needed comparable systems of its own. Winter's framing positions the modernization as a security response as much as a customer service upgrade. The stated rationale that criminal actors were already adopting comparable technology suggests the agency's investment decision was driven in part by concerns about being outpaced by illicit networks operating across the same border infrastructure rather than purely by a desire to reduce wait times for tourists. The new system links Sangster International Airport, Norman Manley International Airport, and the Montego Bay Cruise Port at Freeport into a single digital framework, while connecting the Immigration Agency with the Jamaica Customs Agency, the Jamaica Defense Force, and the Jamaica Constabulary Force through centralized data sharing. Winter stated that this integration would reduce costs and reduce human error or corruption. Under this system, data on arriving British tourists, American cruise passengers, and Canadian business travelers is available to multiple Jamaican security agencies simultaneously. Garth Williams, the current CEO of the agency, has continued this expansion. In March 2026, the agency signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Management Institute for National Development to build training programs for staff. State Minister Juliette Cuthbert-Flynn said the agency's responsibilities require a highly skilled, professional, and adaptable workforce. The transition in leadership from Winter to Williams did not result in a change of direction for the modernization program. Williams's stated objective, moving the agency from what he characterized as best-in-class toward a fully world-class standard, indicates the agency's institutional priorities remained consistent across the leadership change, and that the training partnership announced in March 2026 was intended to build the internal staffing capacity needed to operate the expanded technology base on an ongoing basis. The agency has set a target of processing passengers in no more than 2 minutes at all ports and turning around passport applications submitted in Kingston within 7 days. A 2-minute per passenger processing target applied across an entire national airport and seaport network is comparable to targets set by immigration agencies in significantly larger and better resourced countries. Meeting that target consistently depends on the automated gate infrastructure described above functioning at scale during peak periods, which is the area where the Gleaners reported congestion issues were concentrated. Jamaica's passport was updated from a handwritten document to an electronic passport with embedded biometric features. Garth Williams stated that every holder of the new passport has biometric information embedded in the document. Jamaica registered the passport with the International Civil Aviation Organization's Public Key Directory, allowing immigration authorities worldwide to verify its authenticity. This places Jamaica's passport in the same verification category as passports issued by the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and European Union member states. Jamaica's immigration agency was the first in the Caribbean to introduce a machine-readable passport. That sequencing is notable because border technology adoption in the Caribbean has generally followed larger economies rather than preceding them, with smaller nations typically adopting a standard only after it has already been implemented and tested in wealthier markets. Jamaica's introduction of a machine-readable passport ahead of other Caribbean nations placed it in the position of an early adopter within its own region on this particular technology, rather than a later adopter following an established regional template. Jamaica also built a national identification system, known as INIDS, operated by the National Identification and Registration Authority. The system is based on a single lifelong identification number per person. Each card includes an NFC chip, remains valid for 10 years, and functions as a digital credential. Piloting began in December 2022, with public rollout starting in November 2024, when approximately 300 individuals received the first cards. Prime Minister Andrew Holness collected his own card and stated that the system provides the basis for Jamaica to describe itself as a digital society and that presenting the NIDS card eliminates the need for other forms of identification, since the card verifies identity directly. The card's function as a single, sufficient form of identification is a departure from the layered identification requirements common in many countries where a driver's license, passport, and separate government-issued ID may each be required for different purposes. If implemented as described by Holness, the NIDS card would consolidate that function into a single document referenced across government and, potentially, private sector services. The program is backed by a $1.3 billion allocation from the Jamaican government and the Inter-American Development Bank, with an additional €9.5 million from the European Union through its Digital Jamaica initiative. 24 enrollment centers are planned, including a mobile unit for rural areas. General public enrollment opened in January 2026. Senator Dr. Dana Morris Dixon acknowledged that Jamaica operates in what she described as a low-trust environment, with citizens expressing concerns rooted in religious objections, privacy issues, and broader institutional distrust. That distrust has historical roots. Colonial administrators and foreign governments collected information on Jamaicans for extended periods without local input into how that information was used. In response to current concerns, the government points to the Data Protection Act, in effect since December 2023, and oversight bodies including the National Identification and Registration Inspectorate and the Information Commissioner's Office. Enrollment remains voluntary. The government's decision to keep enrollment voluntary rather than mandatory, while the oversight framework is still being established, reflects an attempt to build public confidence in the system incrementally, rather than compel participation from the outset. Whether voluntary enrollment will produce sufficient adoption to make the identification system fully effective is not yet established, since public enrollment only began in January 2026. The rollout plan, involving 24 enrollment centers and a dedicated mobile unit for rural communities, indicates the government has designed the enrollment process to address access barriers that might otherwise limit adoption in areas farther from Jamaica's main population centers. Combined with the phased approach, moving from a small pilot group of roughly 300 people in late 2024 to general public enrollment in early 2026, the program has been structured to expand gradually rather than launching nationwide participation immediately, which is consistent with the government's own acknowledgement of operating in a low-trust environment on this issue. Jamaicans living abroad, including in Britain and the United States, are also eligible to obtain a national ID card. This means dual nationals in London or New York exist within two separate digital identity systems. Britain's electronic travel authorization system, fully enforced since February 2026, requires digital pre-authorization for visa-exempt travelers. Jamaica's digital C5 and biometric gate system require advanced data submission from every arriving passenger. Data collected by one system does not automatically transfer to the other, creating separate administrative requirements for the same individuals. For members of the Jamaican diaspora holding dual citizenship or long-term residency in both countries, this means maintaining compliance with two independently operated identification and travel authorization systems, each with its own registration process, renewal schedule, and data handling rules. Neither system currently references the other when verifying identity or travel eligibility. These changes affect the logistics of travel to Jamaica directly. The C5 form can no longer be completed on the flight and must be submitted online in advance. Passengers who do not complete it before arrival face delays, since paper alternatives are no longer standard. Facial recognition is now part of the arrival process at Sangster and Norman Manley. For most travelers, this replaces a slower manual immigration line with an automated one. It also means biometric data is captured and processed by a system operating outside the traveler's home country jurisdiction. For travelers with family ties in Jamaica, this system is now part of the process for each visit. Every arrival is logged through both the digital declaration and the biometric gate system before the traveler reaches customs. The pre-departure requirement changes the standard trip preparation checklist for British and American travelers, adding a digital form to a list that previously consisted primarily of passport validity, accommodation confirmation, and any required inoculations. Because the form must be completed before boarding rather than in transit, travelers who are unaware of the requirement or who attempt to complete it after already reaching the airport are more likely to experience delays than under the previous paper-based system, where the form was distributed automatically during the flight, regardless of whether a passenger had prepared for it in advance. Travel advisories and airline pre-flight communications have increasingly incorporated reminders about the digital C5 requirement since its introduction in 2023, reflecting an adjustment period during which travel intermediaries, including airlines and travel agencies, updated their standard pre-departure guidance to account for the new mandatory step. The requirement applies equally to first-time visitors and to travelers who have visited Jamaica many times before, since the digital declaration must be completed fresh for every individual arrival rather than being stored against a traveler's profile for future trips. Jamaica's build-out took place against a backdrop of broader change in how governments verify travelers. The International Civil Aviation Organization's Public Key Directory, which Jamaica's e-passport is registered with, is the same verification framework used by the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and EU member states, meaning Jamaica's passport can be authenticated through the identical technical channel used for passports issued by considerably larger economies. Within the Caribbean specifically, Jamaica's status as the first country in the region to introduce a machine-readable passport combined with its subsequent rollout of biometric gates, a consolidated border management platform, and a national identification card, places it ahead of most of its immediate regional peers in terms of the technical maturity of its border and identity infrastructure. Other Caribbean Community member states operate a mix of older paper-based systems and partial digital upgrades, though the specific status of border technology in each individual country was outside the scope of the reporting reviewed for this account. The financing model behind Jamaica's rollout, combining domestic capital investment with development bank loans and EU co-financing, is a structure available in principle to other small and middle-income countries pursuing similar modernization. What distinguishes Jamaica's case is less the availability of financing than the speed and consistency with which the program was executed across multiple changes in agency leadership and across several distinct infrastructure projects running concurrently. The consistency of execution across a change in agency leadership, from Andrew Winter to Garth Williams, is a detail worth noting in its own right. Large government technology programs are frequently vulnerable to delay or redirection when the official who initiated them departs, particularly in cases where the program depends on sustained multi-year funding commitments and coordination across several separate agencies. Jamaica's program continued on its original trajectory through that leadership transition, with the new CEO explicitly building on, rather than revising, the modernization goals set by his predecessor. Considered alongside the passenger volume figures at Sangster and Norman Manley, the scale of Jamaica's border modernization is proportionally large relative to the country's population and economic size. A capital program of $112 million at Sangster alone, combined with a $1.3 billion allocation for the National Identification System, represents a substantial share of public and development financing directed toward a single policy area over a 5-year period in a country with a population under 3 million. Measured on a per capita basis, this level of investment in border and identity infrastructure is high relative to the country's overall economic output, which is one factor that helps explain why a government of this size was able to move from a paper-based declaration system to an internationally verifiable, multi-agency digital border architecture within a period of roughly 4 years rather than over a longer, more typical implementation timeline for infrastructure programs of this scope. Taken together, the biometric e-passport, the mandatory digital C5 declaration, the CETA-built facial recognition gates, and the national ID card form a single connected identity and border system, linking who a person is to their movement record. Jamaica now operates the same biometric gates, facial recognition protocols, digital pre-travel authorization, and internationally verifiable passport system that Britain and the United States use at their own borders. Jamaica's passport is verified through the same ICO directory. Its passenger processing target matches or exceeds international standards, and its border ecosystem links every airport and seaport on the island. Despite this infrastructure, Jamaican citizens are still required to obtain a visa to enter the United Kingdom and the United States. British and American citizens can enter Jamaica without a visa, complete a free digital form, and use biometric gates that Jamaica financed and built. Each of the 4 systems described above was developed under a different funding stream and managed by a different combination of agencies, yet they were designed to interoperate. The e-passport feeds identity data into the biometric gates. The biometric gates confirm identity against the digital C5 submission, and the National Identification System is intended to eventually serve as the underlying identity record, referenced across government services more broadly. This level of integration between passport, entry declaration, biometric verification, and national identity is not yet fully replicated across most Caribbean nations, and represents the specific combination that places Jamaica's system on comparable technical footing with much larger economies. Viewed as a single infrastructure rather than 4 separate initiatives, the practical effect for a British or American traveler is that their identity is verified multiple times within a single trip, first through the digital C5 submission before departure, then through the biometric gate on arrival, with the passport itself serving as the anchor document connecting both processes. Each of these checkpoints operates independently, but references the same underlying identity data, which is what distinguishes an integrated border system of this kind from a collection of separate, unconnected upgrades. Visa requirements for Jamaicans traveling to Britain were introduced in 2003. Before that year, Jamaicans could travel to the UK without a visa. The cheapest UK visa currently costs approximately $133, and a 2-year visa exceeds $500. Jamaica is the only country with the British monarch as head of state that requires its citizens to obtain a visa to enter the UK. Most Caribbean nations retain visa-free access to Britain. Within the Commonwealth, specifically, this makes Jamaica's position unusual. Nations that share the same constitutional relationship with the British monarch are not, as a rule, subject to UK entry visa requirements, which makes Jamaica's case an exception within that group of countries rather than the norm. Other Caribbean Commonwealth realms and republics, including several that share comparable population sizes and economic profiles with Jamaica, are not subject to the same UK visa requirement, which sets Jamaica apart from its immediate regional peer group on this specific point of policy. In January 2025, Britain introduced its electronic travel authorization requirement for visa-exempt travelers, which initially created uncertainty in Jamaica. British High Commissioner Judith Slater issued a clarification confirming that Jamaicans would continue to require a visa. Full enforcement of the ETA began in February 2026. Since the scheme launched in October 2023, 24.8 million authorizations have been issued. The fee increased from £16 to £20 in April 2026. The confusion surrounding the ETA's introduction stemmed from the fact that the new authorization system was primarily aimed at travelers who did not previously need a visa at all, extending a layer of digital pre-clearance to nationals who could already enter Britain freely. Because Jamaicans already required a full visa rather than falling into the visa-exempt category the ETA was designed for, the clarification from the British High Commission was necessary to confirm that the new system did not change Jamaica's underlying visa requirement in either direction. Jamaica's Foreign Minister, Orlando Terrelong, stated that Jamaicans should be able to travel freely to the UK, and that easing restrictions would reflect a more unified Commonwealth. He noted that Europeans and Americans generally travel with minimal restriction, and that the Jamaican government would like the same access for its citizens. Petitions submitted to the UK Parliament have raised the same concern. One petition, which gathered over 5,000 signatures, argued that requiring Jamaicans to pay a fee and apply for a visa, given that Jamaicans were the largest group to migrate to Britain as part of the Windrush generation, represents an ongoing failure to address that history. A separate petition noted that Jamaicans traveled to Britain freely before 2003, that British citizens still travel to Jamaica without restriction, and described the current arrangement as inconsistent. Both petitions frame the visa requirement in terms of reciprocity, contrasting the free movement British citizens have into Jamaica with the paid, application-based process required of Jamaicans traveling in the other direction. The Windrush generation is directly relevant to this asymmetry. In 1948, the ship Empire Windrush brought Caribbean passengers, many of them Jamaican, who had been invited to help rebuild Britain after the war. They worked in infrastructure, healthcare, and public transport, and their descendants became part of British society. Under current rules, their relatives in Jamaica must pay a fee and apply for a visa to visit family in the UK, while British citizens travel to Jamaica without restriction or cost. The parliamentary petition cited above framed this specifically as a Windrush-era policy inconsistency. A generation of Jamaicans who travel to Britain without a visa, and whose labor is publicly credited with contributing to Britain's post-war reconstruction, is followed by a policy environment in which their descendants and relatives face a paid application process to visit the same country. The 2003 change did not affect Britain's access to Jamaica, which has remained visa-free throughout. The contrast referenced in these petitions is specifically generational. The Windrush arrivals themselves traveled to Britain without a visa requirement, and it was only in 2003, more than 5 decades after their arrival, that the visa requirement was introduced for their country of origin. Their children, grandchildren, and other relatives who remained in Jamaica are the population now subject to the fee and application process referenced in the petitions, while family members who settled in Britain, along with British citizens more broadly, retain unrestricted access to Jamaica in the other direction. The same pattern exists with the United States. Jamaica is not included in the U.S. Visa waiver program, meaning Jamaican citizens require a B1 or B2 visa, which involves a formal application, an in-person interview at the U.S. Embassy in Kingston, and associated fees. The visa can be valid for up to 10 years, but obtaining it requires a process that American travelers to Jamaica do not face the U.S. Visa waiver program currently includes nations across Europe, as well as several in Asia and the Pacific, allowing their citizens to travel to the United States for short stays without a visa, generally through a simpler electronic pre-clearance process rather than an embassy interview. Jamaica's exclusion from that program means Jamaican citizens face the more extensive B1 or B2 process regardless of their travel history or ties to the United States, a requirement that applies uniformly rather than being adjusted based on an individual applicant's prior travel record. The United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom account for approximately 94% of stopover arrivals to Jamaica, with the United States alone responsible for 74%. American arrivals increased more than 16% in 2023, with New York contributing over 350,000 visitors and Florida over 326,000. Jamaica generated $4.3 billion in tourism revenue in 2024. With a record 4.3 million visitors, the second highest total in the Caribbean after the Dominican Republic. Tourism represents over 10% of Jamaica's GDP and 53% of its foreign exchange earnings. These figures indicate that Jamaica's three largest source markets for tourism are also the three countries most directly involved in its visa asymmetry: the United States and the United Kingdom, which require Jamaicans to obtain visas, and Canada, which maintains own separate entry requirements for Jamaican citizens. The concentration of both tourism dependency and visa asymmetry within the same small group of countries is a structural feature of Jamaica's international position, rather than a coincidence of overlapping unrelated statistics. Jamaica's economy is therefore substantially dependent on travelers from the same countries that require Jamaican citizens to obtain visas in return. Because tourism revenue depends on maintaining open access for these visitors, Jamaica has limited ability to impose reciprocal restrictions, even as it continues to invest in the infrastructure that processes these arrivals. This creates a structural constraint on Jamaica's negotiating position. A country whose foreign exchange earnings depend heavily on a small number of source markets is not well positioned to introduce reciprocal visa requirements against those same markets without risking a measurable impact on tourism revenue. As a result, Jamaica's approach has been to continue upgrading the infrastructure that processes visitors from these countries rather than to restrict their access, while separately pressing its case through diplomatic channels for reduced restrictions on Jamaican travelers going in the other direction. Jamaican passport holders currently have visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to 89 countries and territories, placing the passport 54th on the Henley Passport Index. Britain and the United States both rank within the top 10. Jamaica's border technology developed rapidly relative to this ranking. The country moved from handwritten passport books to biometric e-gates within roughly a decade. The C5 declaration moved from a paper process to a mandatory digital system within months of the policy change. A country without a national identification system introduced a chip-embedded digital ID card, backed by over $1 billion in investment. These changes occurred while Jamaica welcomed more than 4 million visitors annually and recovered from a Category 5 hurricane that caused an estimated $6 to $8 billion in damage. The pace of this build-out stands in contrast to Jamaica's position on the Passport Ranking Index, which measures a different variable, not the technical sophistication of a country's own border systems, but the access its citizens are granted by other countries' border systems. A country can rank highly on infrastructure development while ranking comparatively low on international access, because the two measures are determined independently, one by domestic investment and the other by the visa policy set by other governments. This shift is part of a broader international trend. Britain operates its ETA system. The European Union has activated its entry and exit system and continues developing ETIAS. The United States operates ESTA. Jamaica's border systems now match many of the technical standards used by these larger, wealthier nations, while its citizens continue to face visa requirements that travelers from those same nations do not face when visiting Jamaica. The current state of this relationship reflects two separate developments moving at different speeds: Jamaica's rapid build-out of border and identity technology, and the continued visa requirements imposed on Jamaican citizens by Britain and the United States. Those two developments have not yet been reconciled by either government. Jamaica's stated diplomatic position, expressed by its foreign minister, is that the technical modernization of its border system supports its case for reciprocal easing of visa requirements. Neither the UK government nor the US government has issued a public response directly addressing that argument or indicating whether Jamaica's border and identity infrastructure factors into ongoing discussions about visa policy for Jamaican citizens. Taken as a whole, the reporting reviewed here describes a specific and measurable gap. On one side, a set of verifiable technical achievements, including ICAO registration, biometric gate deployment matching major international airports, and a nationally integrated border database. On the other side, an unchanged set of visa requirements imposed on Jamaican citizens by two of the three countries that supply the majority of its tourism revenue. Whether or how that gap narrows going forward will depend on decisions made in London and Washington that, as of this reporting, have not yet been publicly addressed in relation to Jamaica's border modernization specifically.